Greetings, Mr. and Mrs. Middle America and all the ships at sea. In for George Norrie, this is Ian Punnett on a Friday night, a fun Friday night. And to the hostile invading alien armies hovering silently behind their cloaking devices just outside of Earth's atmosphere, remember, eat the Canadians first. And if you go to coasttocoastam.com and go look in the carousel, you'll see that the Department of Defense has issued their annual report on the effort to investigate UAPs, as they call them now, right? It indicates a considerable number of new cases that have been collected. Their analysis to date has found that the phenomenon is largely prosaic, which is an interesting use of word, than alien in nature. But, you know, we've heard this before, and then a year later they go, yeah, well, you know, we really couldn't figure that one out. So even if it's 10%, I mean, even if it's 2%, it's still amazing to think of what is happening in the skies, both with our military and our commercial and private planes. So take a look at that story while you're online at coasttocoastam.com. And then everybody's getting ready for the big Halloween gallery submissions. So, you know, Lex and others are looking for your spookiest bits of personal art, things that we can post. Not stuff you stole from other people, but stuff that you made. Let's celebrate you. We'll do open lines coming up later on, and we'll give you the chance, too, to talk with our main guest, Harvey Kubernik. Harvey has been on many times on Coast to Coast. He is an expert in all of the real stories of rock and roll. He's got a new book out, which it literally just arrived today, so I haven't had a chance to delve deeply into it, but it's perfectly timed because this new book about the Rolling Stones comes out almost, right around the same time as the new Stones album. Now you're thinking to yourself, a new Rolling Stones album, they've got billions of. Well, not with new material. And new material featuring people in a collaborative sense that really kind of freshen the Stones' sound. Which is kind of cool. We'll hear more about that coming up. But the tracks I really like are the ones with Elton John on piano. But more on that coming up in just a second, because if you're saying to yourself, oh, my God, okay, that's cool, there's a new Stones album, think of it this way. Oh, that's really cool. It's a good Stones album. And they've been responsible for their share of dreck over the course of their career. But this one's not. And it's getting great reviews, too, coming up. We'll talk more about that. And a quick look at what's coming up this weekend. At least I want to give a nod and a thank you to somebody on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Like I said, open lines coming up later on tonight. That's always fun on Coast to Coast. And we'll be playing a lot of Stones bumpers to celebrate the new tracks, including some of the new tracks as bumpers coming up on Coast to Coast AM, just to give you a little taste of how good I think this new album really is. But I want to mention something before I get too much further, because I'm grateful for it, and I've had a lot of fun talking about it in the past. But this Sunday night, I will be inducted into the Kansas Association Broadcasters Hall of Fame. That's part of a Distinguished Service Award, which is, I think, they haven't told me, but I think it's in recognition of what we were able to do with this radio station that serves the campus in Riley County in Kansas, Wildcat 91.9. And the really cool part, it's a new alternative and hip-hop station, but a lot of the kids just like to talk. So they'll play a couple of records an hour, and then they kind of turn their own little talk shows on the air. And then we do a lot of sports talk, and we do a lot of sports programming, like the game coming up tomorrow against TCU. I'm really proud of these kids, and I think that's where I'm getting some of the credit for how fast. It was only within 4 years that we took the station from kind of barely a blip It was just slightly better than Spotify, maybe. And we won we were voted best college radio station in the nation. And we're not done. We're still making and innovating, and we have a lot of digital media that we do. And if you want to see some of that, you can take a look at wildcat919.com. But I'm looking forward to Sunday night, even though I don't think I deserve to be in the Kansas Association Hall of Fame, because I'm, most of the people that are inducted into these things are really, they've been in the state for a long time, like decades, and that's, this seems to me there's some other people that are really deserving that I hope get in next year. In fact, Harvey Kubernik, I think you'll relate to me when I say this. I feel a little bit like the Joan Baez, who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I feel a little bit like I don't quite belong there, but, okay, I'll take it. How are you doing, Harvey?
How we doing? Pleasure to return to your show and, of course, talk to a fellow Pisces. And congratulations on your honor. I guess we'll have to go to Gates Barbecue to celebrate.
And I would, too, although my doctor wants me to keep my sodium down. That sounds pretty good to me.
You just beat me to the punchline. I'm kind of on a red meat occasionally, but, they're not listening. So
yeah, I will tell you something. If I have to make an exception, it will be for Gates. I'm a big Gates guy, too. So congratulations on the new book.
Oh, it's sometimes I don't have to tell you this. You deal with the ministry and the pioneering work you've done. Sometimes gifts arrive, or
right.
Jobs arrive, or people arrive that you don't know. They just show up at the right time.
Right.
And I don't want to say I programmed this gig, but I went down Big Stone's rabbit hole a few months ago, just a week of playing Rolling Stones. And yes, I will admit it was largely 63 to 78 Rolling Stones.
Right.
I want to be clear on that.
Right.
And then the email came from a UK representative of a publishing house. And, thanks to Google or the Internet, the name Harvey Kubernik gets aligned with the Rolling Stones because I have been writing about them for 48 years.
But along with a lot of other bands, though, too, which is surprising to me that they made that strong connection for you on this one.
Well, but you know what? I think what's happening is let's try to do something different with the Rolling Stones. Let's not have the mandate where somebody who's English has to write about the Rolling Stones. It's sort of analogous when Lou Adler, the record producer, called me, 10 years ago, and asked me to write the liner notes for the deluxe edition of Carole King's Tapestry.
Right.
Now, you know how this journey works. Most of the mindset out there is there has to be a woman who should write about Carole King. Lou Adler doesn't think that way. And the people in England thought maybe Harvey Kubernik, who's logged a lot of times with the Rolling Stones, whether it be in rehearsal or studios or the 62 shows, I think, maybe I could bring something different to the game. And because I had archive interviews with Keith Richards and Bill Wyman, and then when I saw the briefing or the sample photos, I was looking at photos of shows that I had been to.
Oh, fun.
And again, there was no negotiations or politics or nepotism or cronyism. We'd love you to write the introduction to this book. I'm right there. Sign me up.
Yeah, really. The Rolling Stones Icons I personally enjoy seeing candid photography from band members taking pictures of each other, but also the intimates that were in their circle, as opposed to your standard sort of PR release or album cover posing, and that's what you've been able to capture. In part, thank you to Bill Wyman, right?
Well, yeah, Bill Wyman is a contributor to this book, and over the years I'd interviewed Terry O'Neill, a photographer, and Jared Mankiewicz. And of course Ed Cariff. I have watched some of their visual images or their seminal photos made the impression on me at 13, 14, and 15 that I need to check this band out and stick with them.
Right.
And right now, since I've watched the industry, we'll call it the industry business,
right,
whatever you want to call it, machinations behind the curtain, I've watched bands hire their own photographer, and you don't really get the glimpses or the candid stuff. And none of this stuff is salacious or anything, but you get to see the band in stages. Linda McCartney has some pictures in this volume. And so I set the tone. I wrote the introduction. I bring everybody in to the frame game, and I know the impact of this book. I just the emails I get and people like almost crying on the phone because there's probably been 100 books on the Rolling Stones, but I'm affiliated and I'm the tour guide of a volume that I know penetrates.
Yeah, you're Virgil at the front of the boat holding the lamp.
Yeah, it's just, and again, it's something that I learned from the band leader, Horace Tapscott, who said, we are in collaboration, not in competition. And I know that this is a collaborative effort. And again, I just set the table and I disappear. And the photographers log the time with the band. But, I said this in an interview that's in Reader's Digest in the UK that just came out, where I actually said it in the interview, often we see, and this goes to your listenership and, of course, yourself, we often see photos of bands, and there'll be a photo credit, or it'll say Getty Images or Associated Press.
Right.
But, do you ever really get to know or meet or talk or hear the insights from the people who carry cameras, who chronicled the action? That rarely happens. Now, I made it a point, the way I interview engineers and the backroom people, to always talk to the photographers and to utilize them or display them, because long before things became, shall we say, corporatized or band-controlled, you actually saw some glimpses revealing peeks into the development of groups, visually, clothing, wardrobe, fashion, equipment, hair, length. And I think this book propels the images. I would buy this book.
Right.
That's my barometer.
Well, and as a celebration of their art, Rolling Stones icons would make, I'm just going to say it, make a great gift for somebody coming up this holiday season, just for that reason. This will be, it's, whether they think of it as a coffee table book or whether they think of it as an heirloom book, the photographs capture so much and you frame it so perfectly in the introduction. So, we're going to play some tracks from the new album. I'm surprised at how vital this new Rolling Stones album is.
Well, I've heard a few things, and Elton John still plays like a teenager.
Yeah.
And I don't want to use the word I was privileged, but I guess that's the term. I've been in the recording studio where the Stones did some of this recording.
Oh, cool.
I know the engineers. I know the room tone. That's part of my gig.
Right.
The environmental graphic. And I know how hard, if that's the word, the band, probably under Mick Jagger's directive, that, and I know what kind of competitor he is, that he wanted to, and the band, of course, including some of the changes in the group. I think they really wanted to do something differently. I was a bit leery when all the all-star contribution people were sort of getting leaked out there, only because I've seen that dog and pony show before.
With many of the same people.
This time it really works.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised in one sense to see Lady Gaga do that. I mean, I'm not surprised because, I mean, I think she kind of, I'll say it, you don't have to agree, kind of weasels her way into a lot of things. But I think the work she did with Tony Bennett was really solid. And I just, it's okay with the Stones on the track that she works on. But to your point, when you go back, you think about the Rolling Stones and you think about the Brian Jones, controversy. Was he killed by Mick and was he and I'm getting the sense that none of that ever, and it was really more of a sense of despair, not animosity from the band toward Brian Jones because of his excessive drug use and essentially the way in which he made himself less and less relevant until he died.
I couldn't agree with you more, Brian Jones, Pisces.
Right.
The band wanted to tour America. There are things like passports and visas that are mandatory ammunition for a band to tour. And if one of your members, can't answer the bell, that's sometimes people have to be replaced. And I understand. I mean, Brian Jones, founder of the band, I'm well aware of his contributions. I've written about him extensively. But bringing it up to date, what I like about what the Rolling Stones are doing now is I like the fact that Stevie Wonder is on.
Yeah.
I treasure the ground that Stevie Wonder walked.
Yeah, me too.
I've met him a handful of times.
Have you? I'm so jealous.
Oh God, he is at some of my, I don't want to sound maudlin, some of crossroad moments in my life. There's been a few where I'd run into him or his handlers, at a bank, and they would, they waved me over. You know Stevie, don't you? I said yes, and he would feel my face.
Oh, that's great.
And he'd say, "Your name, aren't you English?" And I said, "Well, not really, but I used to write for Melody Maker." Oh, yeah, English newspaper. Oh, England, real good to me. And so just to know that Stevie's on this record, and he's had some health problems in the last year, well documented.
Right.
I'm just happy. Plus, again, I don't want to make a big epis about this, but I love the studio that the Stones did a lot of this recording, and they brought in a new producer, and I think Don helped out in a couple of tracks. I know what the studio and the room and the engineers and the console and the tape stock and the digital machine does to help create the magic, audio that we covet. And I kind of maybe see the music a little different because this is part of my job as a reporter, an observer, a participant.
Right.
Sonically, the few things that I've heard really sound really good, and it'll make me for the first time in many years, although I love the blues record they did a couple of years ago. Right. I want to hear this on headphones.
Yeah.
I really think it may really be striking.
Well, I'll play a bumper coming up in just a second, and for people that want to hear it, the new Stones, I think my take is that it all starts with the writing, and there's a bunch of on Tattoo You, a lot of those songs are kind of mailed in, and I think they've done a lot of that sort of work where they got together, they needed to release something because they were going to tour again or whatever. And it just, it was all right, but it wasn't it didn't show any inspiration. It didn't, and I think these collaborations actually make them sound as though they are jamming again as young people, as opposed to business people who recognize that they need to write something so that they can get royalties on them instead of doing other people's music. So we'll do that coming up in just a second, and we'll talk more about some of the other works, too, that Harvey has been involved with in the past. But when we open up the phones, I know there's a lot of people that are still very interested in some of the intricacies of the Rolling Stones mysteries, and that they've helped to foster them. So I'll address some of those coming up, and then we'll leave the rest to you on the way on Coast to Coast AM. In for George Norrie, this is Ian Punnett. So, Harvey, that's a cool tune.
Listen, it's in a world where we have so much variety, whether it be rap music or EDM or singer-songwriter, ballads, acoustic music, something happens when you kind of hear a raucous rock and roll,
right,
Chuck Berry-inspired riff, even his bumper music.
Yeah.
It kind of, things start jumping a bit.
Yeah, and it builds.
And I haven't felt that way on the Rolling Stones albums. For the live thing is a different scenario.
Right.
I haven't felt, maybe close to them in the audio world. I'm talking product for a very long time. And maybe I'm rejoining the fan club a bit, And I guess you feel the same way too.
I do, and what I caught myself doing was hitting replay on that tune, and I'm like, I want to hear it again. That's been a while.
I do want to amplify one other thing, and not because I'm a child of Hollywood, but when the Stones come to town and record in Hollywood, like some of the new record on Sunset Boulevard at the studio,
right?
I think a lot of people forget. Maybe that's my job is on the expedition. That literally, 90% of their recordings from 1964 to 1967 were done on Sunset Boulevard, where a lot of the new record was done at this studio. They did a lot of their seminal albums with the producer Andrew Loog Oldham at RCA Studios, and then they did Bridges to Babylon in the same facility. And so there is the influence of Hollywood and Sunset Boulevard. And I've always said that the Rolling Stones records, could you imagine if the albums you cherish from 64 to 67, that little block, imagine if they were recorded in New York instead of the flexibility and the environmental graphic of Hollywood and Sunset Boulevard. The setting, the bioregional environment does play a part in what we eventually hear. And I think some of that has seeped in this new recording.
You remind me of the conversation around the TAMI Show.
Well, I'm the expert on that one. Believe me.
So I'm going to turn to you on that, because I think it's still a lot of people don't know about this. But it still pops up a little bit, like in the biopic with James Brown. And, as legend goes, the band was still in 1964. When it first toured America, they hadn't even had a hit, right, on American radio. They were kind of obscure. I think, didn't Bill Wyman or somebody describe it as an absolute disaster, the first tour of the United States?
There's a lot of myths about that. And listen, I was 12 years old across the street from the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium.
Shut up.
At a surfboard shop. I did not know what was going down, although I sure noticed a lot of girls wearing short skirts. I was too busy with my surfer pal, longboarder Peter Piper, buying paraffin wax for our con surfboards. I actually had a Makaha skateboard. I didn't know what was going on. But in the 50 years of reporting and interviewing everybody associated with the TAMI Show, director, producer, band members, choreographers, and Sting references it in one of his songs as well with the Police. let's just be really clear that it was a 2-day shoot with a rehearsal. It was sort of, shall we say, like all Hollywood movies, because
Right.
I've been on a lot of film sets. It's shot out of sequence. And so, even the order of what we see on DVD now or on TV, that's not, with the exception of the hosts, Jan and Dean. I mean, sure, the Stones, James Brown, the Stones had to follow James Brown, but there was an hour to wait, or there was a lot of break time to set up equipment and things like that. It isn't this situation as perceived by all of us.
Right.
What counts is the product that impacts us. And the genius work of Jack Nietzsche as the musical director of the TAMI Show. I just have been in the studio with a wonderful guitarist, Don Peake. He did 10 years with Ray Charles. He's on a lot of the Jackson 5 records. He did many years with Barry White. Don Peake is in both the TAMI Show band in the orchestra.
Right.
He's also in the big TNT show, which is kind of this sister to the TAMI Show. So I have talked extensively with these people, and last time I was on your show, when I was touting my book on music documentaries, Roxette Doc,
right.
We talked about the TAMI Show and some of these things, and so I've made it a point to talk to the participants, and they have their own stories. The truth is often in the middle, but it does work. And both Mick Jagger, has told the story that he actually had to sort of do some ministry work with James Brown when it was explained to James Brown, listen, we're going to be kind of following you. And even Mick said, it's kind of shot out of a sequence. It's going to be a put together project. I don't think James Brown was having any of that. But I actually think, and I've talked to Jack Nietzsche, the late Jack Nietzsche, extensively about the TAMI Show, and he thought James Brown opening, if you want to use that term, for the Rolling Stones, or them following his act. With James, it wasn't act, it was life on stage. That he thought it inspired the Rolling Stones to take it to another level. And for all of us as consumers, guess what? We like both of them, James Brown and the Rolling Stones and the Motown acts and Jan and Dean. And it's such a time capsule of rock and roll, isn't it?
Well, I don't want to go over the old ground that we tackled last time, but I will say what I like most about the story, is that Mick Jagger got his comeuppance, if that part of the story is true, of James Brown telling Mick Jagger, follow that. Because he knows that, Jagger had been ripping off a lot of his moves. And nobody did it better than the original hardest working man in show business. So, I mean, I look at that and I say, I hope that part of the story is true. I do know that, as you have said before in the past, that I think maybe it wasn't you, but somebody said that. I mean, didn't they regret doing it? I mean, wasn't it like many of the Stones performers were like, that was a huge mistake to try and go on that stage?
Sort of, but the interesting thing is the bands, everybody who participated, it was a package deal, and everybody got paid quite handsomely in 1964 fees.
What would be a 1964?
I think every person involved, I'm talking every act, got $25,000 each.
Wow.
Now, they did surrender all the rights then.
Wow.
I'm talking about product, television, movie exhibition.
That is a ton of money back then, though.
It was put together by GAC, General Artists Corporation, kind of the booking agent. And so even, shall we say, the other people on the band, the groups, besides the Stones and James Brown and the Motown artists, so everybody got a nice payday. And here they are at the beach in Southern California. So I don't think anybody regretted anything about that. And sometimes when you have that baptism by fire, look, the Stones I'm sure it helped fuel their records that they were recording on Sunset Boulevard at RCA right after that, or when they did extra touring. And then the Stones, and by the way, Mick Jagger had watched Little Richard probably 30 times on a 1963 tour with the Everly Brothers. Don Peake and I were talking about this. So he was already looking at Ike and Tina Turner and Motown music and Little Richard. And, of course, he went to the Apollo before or after to go see James Brown. But he's never hidden the fact that the influences he wore on his sleeve. And eventually he became his own performer after soaking up the DNA of these legends.
But, okay, let me just fundamentally, since you know the TAMI Show, and for people who don't, it's worth looking at and it's worth looking into because it's so fascinating. And did we ever agree on what exactly TAMI, T-A-M-I?
Well, Teenage American Music International.
Okay.
That's
right.
Kind of where it comes from. But I've interviewed the director, Steve Bender, a couple of times. But, because I know his history, and he went to L.A. High School, and he's another native Angelino. I mean, Steve had worked on a show called Jazz Scene USA in like 60 and 61. So his blocking techniques or his directorial style, it came from jazz and improv, but he also knew how lights were working, and he knew to bring in the choreographer David Winters and also Tony Basil. So there was choreography and dance and energy and impulse, and also it was so well done. Plus, it was in a new kind of film stock called Electronovision, which was short-lived. If you've ever seen the movie Harlow, it was kind of a different direct. It was sort of like you shoot it on video and then you put it back to like film.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a different kind of black and white film experience. It didn't last long due to it was kind of expensive, but that was something developed from TV station KTLA out here. So the film stock it plays a part, again, like I was talking earlier about the studios and room tone and the environmental aspect. It even brings you in a little deeper, maybe. Although it's all been transferred now and highlighted on DVD and Blu-ray, and it's a little different. But it was not your traditional shoot quick black and white concert footage of a rock and roll band and lip sync. It really was a 2.5-day kind of concert experience that we got to see in theaters, and then it disappeared for a long time because there was no video outlets. There was no VCRs. There was no DVDs. Then it came back, and now it's a really good discovery for anybody who wants to see that era.
And to see Terry Garr, right, dancing in the background with
Tony Basil, and
Tony Basil.
Maybe Anita Mann's in there too.
Oh,
but,
really?
I mean, it was a thriving, throbbing Los Angeles experience, and it kind of bleeds into the things that Jack Good would do the following year when he brought us Shindig on television.
Right.
I mean, it all comes from.
Yeah, I can see that.
You can see the correlation.
But is it not true, then, though, that the Stones insisted on going last, and that's what the regret is that they should have been more respectful of James Brown and the energy that he brought to a stage, regardless, as you say, whether or not there was an hour's gap for resetting cameras and lights or whatever, that they recognized, even if the story's not true about James Brown passing Mick Jagger in the wings, saying to him, go on top that, that it was still that was still the Stones' choice, that they were the last act, and as maybe at the time they feel like they really hadn't earned that yet.
Well, you know what? Part of me agrees with you, and part of me bends to Jack Nietzsche, the musical director who knew the Rolling Stones and
Right.
brought them in and said to Steve Bender, they're hot, they're going to be huge, they do roots music. And I think Jack told me more than once he suggested or determined the order because he knew, let's start it off with some surf music or pop vocal,
Right.
Jan and Dean. Let's take everybody through some other English groups early on, Jerry and the
Pacemakers, right.
Billy J. Kramer. Let's let the Motown artists, whether it be the Supremes or of course Marvin Gaye, let's let Chuck Berry kick it off pretty early to set up the Stones, and Chuck Berry is their ancestral godfather.
Right.
I think Jack really set it up that way. The Stones and management and their record label probably didn't have the clout or power in 1964 to demand this kind of stuff. I think it just kind of worked out that way. But Jack Nietzsche saw the promise of the Rolling Stones very early. And, he probably liked to put them into a baptism by fire thing. And by the time they played the show and it was taped, and by the time they started playing, they took off. And Jack Nietzsche's told me in two different books, when the Stones appeared, it was a new type of emotion. Now, I don't know if he was comparing or contrasting James's gig, and
Right.
James was otherworldly. But the Stones at least held their mud pretty much, that it was not a disaster. And I think as we look at it now, I'm just glad we have Brian Jones on screen and we can see that original band
Right.
at that moment.
Not stoned out of his mind like he was
Thank you.
during Sympathy for the Devil or whatever. It was that other thing that you could see him in.
Where he was quite passive, shall we?
Yeah. Let's just say it was passive. Okay, so that's the TAMI Show. Do you have photos in this book, Rolling Stones icons from that period? I didn't.
I know there's 1964 photos, but there was probably some rights issues where they couldn't license some things. But there are, pictures from 1964, and there are, pictures from the Rock and Roll Circus and some of their television appearances. But I think what happened with this book, and it happens largely, I think, with the Stones, is we are, maybe you and I are a bit different and some people in your listenership, somehow most of the Stones photos end up being live stage shots.
Oh, okay.
As opposed to, because photographers and studios, people weren't taking a lot of pictures of rock and roll bands in studios in '64. They might have been a set person or somebody aligned with a television station. Nobody was carrying a lot of their own photographers in that '63, '64 world. That's why we're very grateful when we see early Motown acts and some of those people, because you don't see tons of the photos then.
It seems to me, though, in the Bill Wyman collection, there's a lot more photos of them lazing about, not on stage, obviously.
Oh, yes, because Bill Wyman told me, Bill Wyman has enough memorabilia that it filled 6 barns.
Right. I love that documentary on.
Oh, yeah. And when I interviewed him in 2002, when he put out a collection of some, it was only 2% of his collection.
Right.
I mean, at least he was running camera or acquiring visuals and imagery and keeping ticket stubs. And there are some people that are like that. Gene Simmons of KISS keeps everything, too, and it's on huge storage lockers and all that.
That and, as legend goes, it more, too. All right, so we'll leave that there for now, but we'll come back next hour with your calls and your questions for Harvey Kubernik. The book is Rolling Stones Icons. It happens to come out at the same time as this new Stones album, which is also good. We'll play a track for that later on, too. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett.